So, last year, the great 2020, from the end of October to early November, Mercury was in retrograde, and that time for me was,
Michael to fly too.
Of course! Oh my God! Robert! Oh God! Done! Someone! Trevor! What it out? It's America!
And I ended up finding out from my friend that during that time period, Mercury retrograde happens and things can get a little disastrous. Now, I'm just starting to get into astrology and trying to understand it all, so I would say my grasp on it is more of a light touch at this point. So if you want to learn more about what Mercury retrograde means, here's a video by Maren Altman. And I thought, wow, that time period sucked for me. And at the end of January, we'll be going into another Mercury retrograde. They happen about 3 times a year, and America will be going through a shift in dynamic around that time. And so I thought it would just be fun to look back at historical events that happened during Mercury retrograde. Now, the big things that Mercury retrograde impact from my research is that it can be specific to a sign, though all signs, as in the zodiac signs, can get hit by it. So I think that Mercury retrograde's impact is like signing business deals and travel. So ideally you would avoid doing these things during that time, to the best of my understanding. Again, not an astrologist. And so looking at the historical events, I'm sure these people thought it was safe. Such as, are you planning to go to a play to cheer up your wife because you just lost your second child? The first one died as well. You have 2 dead children now, and you didn't really want to go to the play, but your wife finally wants to go and do something. You've both been horribly depressed. You're like, alright, I'll cheer up my harm. What's the worst thing that could happen to me? The President of the United States going to a play in 1865. Death! You probably thought you were safe, Abraham Lincoln, but you weren't, because there's something with Mercury retrograde called the pre and post shadow, which is a period of time before and after Mercury retrograde where things can also still be funky. And so his assassination occurred during the pre-shadow period of Mercury retrograde. I actually did a report on Lincoln, and part of it was focused on his assassination and how things got botched. I think that we tend to think of assassinations as well-planned things, but Lincoln's assassination was originally going to be a kidnapping, and then it changed to assassination, and 2 other people were supposed to be assassinated. Like, they were attempting to basically decapitate the government, but the other 2 people wimped out. So Lincoln was the only one dead at the end of the night. And I'm sure when he went there, he was like, okay, what's the worst thing that could happen to me? The president who presided over a civil war, who's disliked by the majority of the country. You know, there's a policeman outside. Oh, he's not? He went to the bar during intermission? Well, at least the door's locked. Oh, it's not? It's unlocked? Anyone can just jiggle the handle and get in? Well, there's a security guard inside, right? No. Cool. We didn't need a president anyways. That's what the vice president's for. The best thing was, Lincoln had assassination attempts on his life before, and yet he was still like, okay, we'll do minimal security. I'm sure the war has just recently ended, and I'm a public figure that's very shootable. Let me just go to a play. No protection. Also, how bad at your job do you have to be like, ah yes, guarding the president who presided over the Civil War. Let me just go to the bar. By the way, same bar was his assassin. So the policeman that was assigned to be on protective duty and his soon-to-be assassin were both at the same bar at the same time for a period of time. That, like, it's not that Booth necessarily recognized the guy, it was just some random policeman, but yikes, that's a yikes from me, John Frederick Parker. But hey, maybe Lincoln's death wasn't totally in vain. Now we know that we shouldn't go places when we're important political figures during Mercury retrograde and the pre-era of Mercury retrograde or the post-era. you know, unless you're inspecting imperial troops of a country that your imperial empire, do you consider yourself an empire? Let's call you an empire, is inspecting of a country you just annexed. That's totally cool. Yeah, what's the worst that could come from inspecting those troops? I mean, definitely not an assassination that would kick off a massive world war, causing millions of death and casualty and ultimately leading to a second world war. Archduke Ferdinand. This also occurred in the shadow period of Mercury Retrograde, and this assassination was also really botched. Like, I mean, I know there was like a 19-year-old involved in it, so I shouldn't be expecting the best, but the first thing they tried to do was they tried to put a bomb under his car and have it blow up, but it went under the wrong car, or it rolled under the wrong car, and it went off, and like the people in that car got injured, and so then they were like, okay, we're gonna go visit the people in the hospital. You know, if I, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir apparent to the Austria-Hungary throne after my cousin had a little accident, and by accident, murder-suicide in a hunting lodge with his mistress, and I'm with my wife and a bomb went off in a nearby car, I would not leave the building I was in. I would put myself in a tank and roll my way back to a country that I am more protected in. But RIP to Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but I'm different. So there ended up being a delay in the road because they weren't notified of the switch, so there was like confusion with the traffic, so you know, travel plans getting messed up. And an assassin who was eating at a cafe after the failed attempt saw him, took the advantage, jumped on the car, and shot Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, and they both tragically passed away. And this led to World War I starting. Now, at this point, at the point in time when Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated, World War I was kind of inevitable. Think of Europe as like the Australia Bush in dry season, and then add a bunch of extra gunpowder kegs, and his assassination was the lit match that was thrown into it that set off the whole thing. But it was waiting to happen. Everybody was allied, there was a lot of tensions, and unfortunately this was just the final tipping point. But I'm sure after those two assassinations, history learned its lesson about having political travel events happen during shadow periods in Mercury retrograde. And definitely wouldn't, like, I don't know, say put up a naval blockade around an island, putting us on the precipice of a nuclear war in the 1950s to 1960s. What's that? The Cuban Missile Crisis? Yes, that occurred during a post-shadow period of Mercury retrograde. Now, to be fair to the Soviets, America did put ballistic missiles, which are long-range missiles, so you don't need to have them super close to the country, in Italy and Turkey first, and then so the Soviets responded by putting missiles in Cuba, and we're going to transfer you more missiles, and then JFK was like, no, put a naval blockade around them. Also, at this point, one of the reasons why in Cuba is very close to America, but also we'd had the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, so it's not like America was totally innocent in these actions, and yeah, it took a lot of tense behind-the-scenes negotiations to make sure we didn't launch into nuclear World War III, but we managed to get out okay. Thank God Twitter wasn't around at that point. So what are we learning? Don't travel by car, don't travel by train, but planes. Planes are cool, right? Specifically, a plane in the 1950s, carrying 19 passengers, going during a snowstorm. That should be cool, right? 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 No, you're gonna crash after 4 failed attempts to land right near the airport, and all 19 passengers are going to die. On that plane contained almost the entire Soviet hockey team, who Vasily Stalin, Stalin's son, was in charge of. When he found out about the plane crash, he panicked and covered it all up, replaced the hockey team, and prayed that his father wouldn't notice. And it worked. Stalin never noticed. Then again, Stalin did not notice his son much, and his son was kind of a failure. Stalin also was kind of a terrible father. And a human being. Right, but those are all just travel things. What's the worst thing that could happen from signing a contract during Mercury retrograde or pre or post shadow? Ever heard something called the Treaty of Versailles? No, you probably did in middle school and then promptly forgot that information after you passed or failed your test. So the Treaty of Versailles was the treaty that was signed post World War I to essentially be like, yes, the war is over, Germany admits that it lost, and now we're going to legally pummel them after militarily pummeling them. So in the treaty, not only did Germany admit that the war was all their fault, they also had to pay for all the damages, and so had to pay war reparations. A lot of economists at the time and afterwards were like, those are really excessive charges, it's not really going to help anything, it's really counterproductive. No country involved really felt like they got a fair deal out of this, and this led to a lot of resentment in Germany, along with the tanking of the economy, especially because the German government had been suppressing the news, and Germany thought they were winning the war, so then the next day after they had finally acquiesced, it's suddenly like, oh no, we were actually losing the war the entire time. By the way, inflation is skyrocketing, and our money is now basically worthless. And this resentment, while it didn't lead directly to World War II happening, it did create this atmosphere that allowed for the Nazi Party to gain rise in power, which would eventually lead to Hitler taking power and Nazi Party taking power and World War II happening. Alright, well, all these events you named so far are political in nature. So what about something that is just a fun event where athletes gather around to celebrate, you know, the peak fitness? Maybe something like running in the 1904 Olympic Marathon. Have you been listening? The 1904 Olympics were like the worst organized to date. And yes, that includes Rio with its construction embezzlement scams. And the marathon was just a pile of hot garbage waiting to kill someone. And it almost did. The route that they had picked out was an incredibly grueling run that had 7 hills from 100 to 300 feet ascension. It had cracked stonework, making the ground really rough and unsteady that the runners would have to dodge. It had several inches of dust on it so that when they were running it would get kicked out of the dust. And they also did not get those sections of the route cordoned off. So cars were going, people were walking their dogs, railroad cars were going. Normal pedestrian traffic was still occurring while this race was going. So not only were these runners running 26 miles, they were running and trying to dodge getting hit with a car. And that's not even the worst part about the marathon. Another thing that made matters worse was that cars were driving alongside with coaches and physicians, and so that was kicking up dust and the runners were having to breathe that in. One contestant collapsed early on in the race because so much dust had coated his esophagus and ripped his stomach lining, and he was hemorrhaging blood and needed immediate medical attention or he would have died. There's only 2 water stations, mile 6 and mile 12, because James Sullivan, the chief organizer, wanted to test the effects of purposeful dehydration. Spoiler alert, nothing good happens when people are dehydrated. There's another contestant who was chased a mile off course by wild dogs, so not only was he trying to run for his country, he was running for his life. A true hero story. Thomas Hicks, another runner, at the 10-mile mark begged his crew for some water, and they responded with, "Now, let's sponge you with warm distilled water." And instead they gave him egg whites and strychnine, which is the first known case of the use of stimulants in the Olympic Games, so there wasn't any regulations about that. Strychnine in small doses at the time was used as a stimulant. But you know what strychnine is? It's rat poison. They gave him rat poison instead of water. Ah, medical school must have been so easy back then. So he ended up continuing to run, and someone had been declared the winner, and it turned out that he'd actually hitched a ride for most of it. So then Thomas Hicks, the dude who was fed poison, was actually the person who was next up to win, and so then they gave him a second dose of the egg whites and strychnine, and this time they had to wash it down with brandy, and then they soaked his body in warm water, and he started hallucinating at the end of the run, thinking they had 20 more miles left to go, and was basically begging to be finished off, and he had to be helped carried over the line. And yeah, he won the Olympic marathon. Poor guy. Alright, well, those are really cool and somewhat concerning events in history that have happened, but do I have anything that's actually occurred during Mercury retrograde? Yes, I do. I think January 21st, 1924 is a nice time to die after leading a long political life and accomplishing many things. Think again. Lenin. Turns out with your death, Stalin is now able to take over and rise to power. Now, Vladimir Lenin was no saint when it came to being in control of Russia or the USSR or Soviet Union or whatever they were calling at the point. His revolution actually probably has a body count of about 9 million. But take all of Lenin's actions and multiply them by cancer when comparing to what Stalin did. Maybe life has you stressed and you decide that you want to take a cruise on the world's newest edition cruise liner, the top of elegance and luxury. Sure, it's during Mercury retrograde, but what's the worst thing that could happen on the Titanic? Yeah, so to put in reference how bad of a loss of life that was, about 1,500 people died and about 2,200 people were on board, passengers and crewmates. And in an example of sometimes things can start getting messed up in the pre-shadow period, the pre-shadow period for Mercury retrograde for the Titanic saw a national coal strike in England, which led to some people having to cancel their trips on different ships and transfer to the Titanic because it had enough coal to go across the Atlantic. And so some people who died on the ship were never even meant to be on the ship in the first place. Well, that's nice, but that's all in the past. Do we have any modern examples? Yes, I do. Bush v. Gore, Florida recount. I started looking this up and I don't feel like I got to all the details, and this happened when I was a little kid, but essentially there were sections in Florida that had a very small margin of error when it came to the votes, so they did an automatic recount, and with each recount the margin of error started getting lower and lower, and there was a court case about whether or not they should keep going or whether they should stop the count. Definitely doesn't bring up any weird memories. Ultimately, Bush ended up becoming president, but I'm told at the time it was a really major event, and man, I'm starting to wonder if maybe American elections have just always been kind of dramatic. Although I wouldn't necessarily call 2020 dramatic so much as traumatizing and terrifying. And the final event I have for you today that occurred during Mercury retrograde in modern times is, drumroll please, yeah, the Fire Festival in 2017. The luxury concert getaway scam occurred during Mercury retrograde. From April 28th to like April 30th was in Mercury retrograde, and then the May 5th to 7th was in the post-shadow period. For those who don't really remember or who haven't checked out the cool documentaries on Netflix and Hulu, basically a bunch of influencers and models started posting on Instagram about the Fire Festival. It's basically this musical festival, and if you want day events, they were like $500 to $1,500 tickets, and you could get a VIP package for $1,200, and you're going to be in eco-friendly houses, and you're going to get your meals cooked by a private celebrity chef, and it was all a lie. It was all fake. It didn't happen. And so the world kind of had a bit of a chuckle as some privileged people had to deal with being inconvenienced after watching a documentary. Yeah, it did kind of look like a garbage mess. But at the end of the day, the real victims were the local population who were hired and ultimately mostly not paid, thanks to the person's attempts to scam everybody out of money. And as a closing note, I would just like to say that, like, I know Mercury retrograde and the planets do not cause bad things to happen. They're meant to be more signs and reflections that bad things can happen, and Mercury retrograde happens like 3 or 4 times a year, so it's not even like the most like, oh, this never happens, or this will be the worst thing happening, or whatever. But sometimes it's fun to just have an excuse to look back at past historical events and be like, oh, this occurred during Mercury Retrograde, a time when it's bad to travel, and you traveled and got assassinated. What an interesting thing to see. If you wanted to learn more about astrology, Maren Altman's YouTube channel talks a lot about it. And if you do need to travel or sign contracts during this time period, it's not that you can't, but you know, just triple, double check everything. And you know, maybe lock your door if you're in a box watching a play and you're the president of the country during a very divisive time and you've already had at least one assassination attempt on you, which involved you having to like ride a midnight train to flee for your life. Just throw that out there. My next video will be whatever I choose to make it on, whenever I choose to make it on, whenever I have the time to make it and edit it, because this girl has started her college courses again. Have a nice day, friends.